Lost llama stood by the cemetery, then visitors heard knocking. The first person to notice the llama by the cemetery gate was Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, who had come to place fresh flowers on her husband's grave and ended up standing in the rain with a bouquet of white chrysanthemums clutched to her chest, staring at an animal that absolutely did not belong there. It was just after 8 on a Saturday morning in the village of Whitestone Hollow, a quiet place tucked between rolling fields, old stone cottages, and the dark line of hawthorn woods. The cemetery sat on the hill behind St. Bartholomew's Church, bordered by an iron fence on one side and a crumbling stone wall on the other. In summer it was peaceful, full of bees and wildflowers. In autumn it became a place of wet leaves, gray skies, and silence so deep that every footstep seemed too loud. That morning mist lay low over the graves. Rain tapped softly against Eleanor's umbrella, and a llama stood directly in front of the cemetery gate. It was tall, cream-colored, and soaked through with long, damp lashes, muddy legs, and a red halter hanging loose around its narrow face. Its woolly coat was tangled with burrs and leaves. A strip of rope trailed from the halter, frayed at the end as though it had snapped or been chewed through. The animal looked exhausted, but it stood with strange determination, blocking the gate as if guarding it. Eleanor blinked. "Well," she whispered, "you're new." The llama turned its head toward her. Its dark eyes were wide and watchful. Eleanor had lived in Whitestone Hollow for 74 years and had seen many odd things near the churchyard. Foxes slipping between gravestones at dawn, sheep escaping from neighboring fields, teenagers hiding behind the mausoleum, convinced no adult had ever been young enough to know that trick. Once, during a summer wedding, a goat had eaten half the bride's bouquet, but she had never seen a llama at the cemetery. She took one cautious step toward the gate. The llama stepped sideways, blocking her path. Eleanor stopped. "I'm only visiting Arthur," she said softly, lifting the flowers as if the animal might understand the purpose of chrysanthemums. The llama made a low humming sound, then it turned its head toward the far side of the cemetery, beyond the old yew trees, where the oldest grave stood near the broken stone wall. Eleanor followed its gaze. Nothing moved there, only mist, leaning headstones, wet grass, and the dark shape of the old caretaker's shed half hidden behind ivy. The llama looked back at her, then toward the far corner again. Eleanor felt the first small thread of unease. Before she could decide what to do, the church door opened below the hill and Reverend Samuel Pierce stepped outside carrying a box of hymn books. He was 58, kind-faced, slightly stooped, and permanently tired in the way village clergy often became from knowing everyone's grief by name. He saw Eleanor by the gate and called, "Mrs. Briggs, is everything all right?" Eleanor did not take her eyes off the llama. "That depends," she said. "Were you expecting livestock?" Samuel followed her gaze and froze. The llama stared at him. Samuel stared back. "No," he said slowly. "I was not." The llama hummed again, then pressed its chest lightly against the cemetery gate, not pushing it open, blocking it. Samuel came closer, careful and slow. "Where did you come from?" The animal's ears flicked. Eleanor lowered her umbrella slightly. "It won't let me in." Samuel frowned. "Perhaps it's frightened." "Perhaps, but it keeps looking over there." She pointed toward the far corner. Samuel looked across the cemetery. For a moment the whole place seemed still. Rain slipped down the old stones. A crow called from the church roof. Wind moved through the yews. Then the llama lifted its head and gave a sharper sound, almost a cry. From somewhere inside the cemetery came a faint noise. Tap. Samuel stiffened. Eleanor's hand tightened around the flowers. Tap, tap. It was soft, distant, rhythmic. Not rain, not branches. Knocking. Samuel whispered, "Did you hear that?" Eleanor's face had gone pale. "Yes." The llama stepped away from the gate for the first time. It walked several paces into the cemetery, then stopped and looked back. The gate creaked open in the wind. Samuel and Eleanor stood motionless. The knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. From the far corner, from near the old caretaker's shed. The llama began walking toward it. Samuel followed. Eleanor followed too because she had outlived war, widowhood, hip surgery, and 3 church renovation committees, and she was not going to be left behind by a nervous vicar and a wet llama. The path through the cemetery was slick with moss and fallen leaves. Samuel moved carefully between the stones, holding one arm out in case Eleanor slipped. The llama went ahead, stopping every few yards to look back. It did not graze or wander. It moved with purpose, ears forward, body tense. As they approached the old section, the knocking grew clearer. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause, then 3 more. Eleanor whispered, "Someone is knocking." Samuel's throat tightened. The old caretaker's shed stood beside a cluster of Victorian graves near the broken wall. It had not been used in years except to store rusted tools, cracked pots, and old boards from previous repairs. The door sagged on one hinge. Ivy climbed one side. Behind it, half covered by weeds and a sheet of corrugated metal, was the entrance to the old burial vault. Samuel knew of it, of course. Everyone did. The Whitestone family crypt had been sealed decades earlier after part of the ground collapsed during a winter flood. The entrance was supposed to be blocked and locked. Children told stories about it. Adults told them not to be ridiculous and then avoided it after dark. The llama stopped at the shed. It lowered its head toward the ground. Then it hummed again. Tap, tap, tap. This time the sound came from below, beneath their feet. Eleanor dropped the chrysanthemums. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribs. "Hello?" he shouted. The knocking stopped. For one terrible moment there was only rain. Then, from underground, barely audible, came a voice. "Help!" Eleanor gasped. Samuel ran to the shed door and pulled it open. It resisted, swollen from damp, then gave way with a crack. Inside were old rakes, a broken wheelbarrow, stacks of rotting wood, and a heavy metal hatch in the floor half hidden beneath a tarp and fallen shelves. The old vault access. The hatch was not fully sealed anymore. One side had shifted downward. Mud had washed in around the edges. Samuel dropped to his knees and pulled at the tarp. The llama stood in the doorway, staring into the shed, breathing hard. The voice came again. "Help! Please!" A child. Samuel turned to Eleanor. "Call emergency services." She already had her phone out, hands shaking. "There's barely signal. Go toward the church, now." Eleanor hurried back through the rain as fast as her knees allowed. Samuel knelt beside the hatch. "Can you hear me?" A muffled answer came from below. "Yes." "What's your name?" "Milo." "How old are you, Milo?" "7." Samuel closed his eyes for 1 second. A 7-year-old child was trapped beneath the cemetery. "Milo, my name is Reverend Pierce. I'm right above you. Help is coming. Are you hurt?" "My foot hurts. It's dark. I can't get out." "Are you alone?" A pause, then a small sob. "No." Samuel's blood went cold. "Who is with you?" "My sister and the baby llama." Samuel looked slowly toward the animal at the shed door. The llama let out a deep, trembling hum. Of course, not lost, not wandering, not blocking the cemetery gate for no reason. It had come because something it loved was underground. Eleanor returned with a breathless shout. "They're coming! Fire brigade, police, ambulance, I got through!" Samuel nodded, still crouched by the hatch. "There are children down there, 2 of them, and an animal." Eleanor gripped the doorframe. "Dear God." The story would later be pieced together from the children's frightened memories, the trail of hoofprints through the woods, and a farmer's report from 3 miles away. The llama's name was Willow. She belonged to a small trekking farm on the other side of Hawthorne Woods, run by a woman named Claire Mason. Willow had given birth 3 days earlier to a tiny cria named Pippin, and because the weather had been poor, Claire had kept mother and baby in a sheltered paddock near the barn. But during the storm the previous evening, a gate latch had broken. Willow and the cria had slipped out, likely frightened by thunder. Their tracks led through the lower field, into the woods, and toward Whitestone Hollow. That same evening, two children, Milo and his 10-year-old sister Sophie, had been staying with their grandfather in the village. Their family had recently lost their grandmother, and Sophie had wanted to visit the grave after dinner to leave a drawing. Milo followed her. They knew the cemetery. They had been there many times, but the rain grew heavy. They took shelter near the old shed. Then they heard a soft crying sound. The baby llama had fallen through a partially collapsed section of ground near the old vault hatch, slipping into the dark chamber below. Willow could not fit through the opening. Sophie and Milo tried to help. The rotten shed floor gave way beneath them, and both children fell into the old vault access tunnel. The hatch shifted above them. The exit jammed. Willow had remained outside all night, unable to reach her baby, unable to free the children. So at dawn, she had gone to the cemetery gate and waited for people. The fire brigade arrived 12 minutes later, though it felt much longer. Fire Chief Anna Morgan took command the instant she stepped into the shed. She was in her 40s, strong-voiced, and had the calm severity of someone who had seen old structures collapse because well-meaning people rushed too quickly. "No one stands on that floor," she ordered. "It's rotten and undermined. Clear the shed. We need supports before opening the hatch." Samuel stepped back reluctantly. The llama did not. Willow pushed toward the doorway, trying to get inside. A firefighter moved to stop her, but she swung her long neck and let out a sharp, distressed cry. Eleanor said, "She has a baby down there." Chief Morgan looked at the llama, then at Samuel. A baby what? A baby llama. For half a second, the chief's face went blank. Then she simply nodded. Of course. A police officer found Claire Mason 10 minutes later after calling nearby farms. She arrived in a muddy Land Rover, barely stopping before jumping out. "Willow!" she cried. The llama turned at the sound of her owner's voice, but did not leave the shed. Claire ran to her, tears already falling, and placed both hands on the animal's wet neck. "You found people," Claire whispered. "Good girl, good girl." Willow hummed frantically and looked toward the hatch. Claire's face crumpled. "Pippin's down there?" Samuel nodded. "And two children." Claire covered her mouth. The rescue became careful and terrifying. Firefighters stabilized the shed walls and floor with temporary supports. A rescue technician drilled a small inspection hole and lowered a camera into the vault access. Everyone crowded around the monitor. The image flickered. Stone walls, mud, broken boards. Then a child's face appeared, pale in the camera light. Milo. Beside him sat Sophie, holding one arm close to her body and trying to look brave, even though her lips trembled. At her feet, curled in a muddy corner, was the baby llama, tiny, cream-colored, shivering, and alive. Willow saw the monitor from the doorway. She made a sound so deep and broken that Eleanor began to cry. Chief Morgan spoke into the microphone attached to the camera. "Milo, Sophie, my name is Anna. We're going to get you out. I need you to stay away from the hatch area if you can." Sophie looked up. "Pippin is cold," Claire whispered. "She knows his name." Milo's voice shook. "We tried to keep him warm." "You did very well," Chief Morgan said. "Help is here now." Sophie said, "Is Willow okay?" Claire stepped closer to the microphone. "She's here, sweetheart. She brought help." Sophie closed her eyes and began to sob. Willow pressed her head against Claire's shoulder. Opening the hatch fully was too dangerous at first. The old vault ceiling had partially collapsed, and mud from the storm had shifted the stones. Firefighters had to secure the entrance before lowering a rescuer. Every minute mattered. The children were cold. Pippin was colder. The air below was damp and stale, though not immediately dangerous. Samuel stood beside Eleanor under the rain outside the shed, hands clasped tightly. "This place should have been sealed properly years ago," Eleanor said, voice shaking. "Yes," Samuel said. "We all knew it was unsafe." "Yes. And we did nothing." Samuel looked toward the old graves, the broken wall, the shed with firefighters moving in and out. He could not argue. Villages were good at remembering the dead and strangely poor at maintaining the things that protected the living. Everyone knew the old crypt was dangerous. Everyone assumed someone else would deal with it. Until children fell in. Until a llama came to the gate. Finally, a rescuer named Ben Clark was lowered through the hatch on a harness. He reached Sophie first. Her wrist was likely broken and she had bruises across one shoulder, but she was alert. Milo's foot was trapped beneath a fallen board and swollen badly. Pippin lay beside them, breathing but weak. "We're bringing the girl first," Ben called up. "No," Sophie protested. "Milo first." Milo shook his head. "Pippin first." Chief Morgan leaned over the hatch. "We are bringing everyone out in the safest order. That is my job, not yours." Even from the monitor, Sophie looked offended. Eleanor whispered, "Good. Still got spirit." Sophie was lifted first. The moment she came into daylight, wrapped in a rescue harness and covered in mud, her father, who had arrived after police called the family, rushed forward with a sound that was almost a sob and almost her name. He caught her as paramedics took over, holding her face between his hands. Milo came next. Freeing his foot took longer, and he cried out when Ben shifted the board. Willow became frantic at the sound, pushing against Claire's hold. "It's all right," Claire murmured into the llama's damp wool. "They're helping him. They're helping." When Milo reached the surface, he was pale and shaking but conscious. He clutched something in his hand, a small drawing, the one Sophie had brought for their grandmother's grave. It was wet and torn, but he had kept it safe all night. Their father broke down completely. Then came Pippin. The tiny Crea was wrapped in a thermal blanket and lifted slowly through the hatch. Claire stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Willow stretched her neck as far as she could, humming desperately. The moment Pippin was placed on the grass outside the shed, Willow pushed toward him. Chief Morgan looked at Claire. "Safe?" Claire nodded, though she was crying too hard to speak. Willow lowered her head and began sniffing the baby all over, nudging, humming, licking mud from his face. Pippin stirred weakly. For one awful moment he did not stand. Then he made a tiny sound. Willow answered immediately. Sophie, lying on a stretcher nearby, turned her head and whispered, "He's alive." Milo began crying again. Everyone did. Pippin was rushed to Claire's Land Rover, where she and a veterinarian who had just arrived began warming him with blankets and fluids. His temperature was dangerously low, but he had no broken bones. The children were taken to hospital. Sophie had a broken wrist and bruises. Milo had a fractured foot and mild hypothermia. Both would recover. The old vault was sealed properly that same day. By evening, the cemetery gate was covered with mud, footprints, rescue tape, and flowers. Eleanor had finally placed on Arthur's grave after everything was over. She stood there in the fading light, looking toward the shed where workers now secured the ground. Samuel came to stand beside her. "Arthur would have said the llama had more sense than the council," she said. Samuel smiled faintly. Arthur often said that about animals. He was usually right. Down the hill, Willow and Pippin were being loaded carefully into Claire's trailer. Willow did not resist. Her baby was beside her now. That was all she had wanted. The story spread through Whitestone Hollow faster than any sermon Samuel had ever given. A lost llama stood by the cemetery. Visitors heard knocking underground. 2 children and a baby llama were rescued from the old vault. By Monday, reporters had arrived. Claire allowed only a short interview, mostly to thank the firefighters and warn people about broken fences and unsafe old structures. When asked whether Willow had understood that humans could help, Claire answered carefully, "I don't know what she understood. I know she stayed with her baby all night. I know she went to the gate when she couldn't reach him. And I know she brought people back to the right place. That is enough for me." Sophie and Milo visited Willow and Pippin 3 weeks later, after both were home from the hospital. Sophie wore a purple cast on her wrist. Milo had a walking boot, and a fierce determination not to look scared near animals, despite having spent a night underground with one. Pippin was in a sunny paddock beside the barn, stronger now, wobbling on long legs and occasionally trying to jump with no clear plan for landing. Willow stood nearby, watchful as ever. When the children approached the fence, Willow lifted her head. Sophie whispered, "Hi." The llama came closer. Claire handed Sophie a small handful of feed, flat palm. Sophie offered it carefully. Willow sniffed, then ate gently. Milo looked at Pippin. "We kept him warm." Claire knelt beside him. "You did. You helped save him." Milo's lower lip trembled. "Willow saved us." Claire smiled through tears. "Yes, she did that too." The children's father, Adam, stood behind them, his face full of gratitude and guilt. He had been the one who had not noticed they'd left the house that evening. He had been upstairs packing away his mother's clothes when they slipped out to visit the grave. Grief, like rainwater, had found every crack in the family. Samuel visited the farm too at Adam's request. They stood by the paddock watching Pippin run tiny circles around Willow. "I keep thinking," Adam said, "if Willow hadn't been there." Samuel nodded. "I know. I should have watched them." "Yes," Samuel said gently. "And the cemetery should have been safer, and the gate at the farm should have held, and the storm should not have come. There is enough guilt to bury everyone if we let it." Adam looked at him. Samuel continued, "Your children are alive. Start there." Adam wiped his eyes. "I'm trying." "That is enough for today." The rescue changed the village. The cemetery was inspected from top to bottom. The old vaults were secured, mapped, and properly sealed. The broken wall was rebuilt. The caretaker's shed was repaired and locked. Warning signs were installed near historical structures, but more importantly, the village council created an annual safety inspection for church property, wells, cellars, and old farm buildings. No one wanted to admit it had taken a llama to make them responsible, but it had. The school invited Claire to bring Willow and Pippin for a safety talk, though Willow refused to leave the trailer at first and Pippin tried to chew the head teacher's scarf. Sophie and Milo stood beside Claire and told their classmates never to enter old buildings or hidden places, even if they thought they were helping. "If an animal is trapped," Sophie said, cheeks pink, "get an adult." Milo added, "Even if it is a baby llama." "Especially then," the head teacher said. Pippin sneezed. The children laughed. Months passed, then years. Willow and Pippin became beloved in Whitestone Hollow, though Claire always reminded people they were not magical creatures or public attractions. They were animals with needs, instincts, fears, and memories. Still, whenever Willow appeared at village events, people looked at her with a certain reverence. The cemetery gate had a small plaque added on the inside of the wall. "Listen when the quiet places knock." Sophie hated the wording at first because it sounded like a ghost story written by adults, but Eleanor loved it. On the first anniversary of the rescue, Sophie and Milo brought a new drawing to their grandmother's grave. This one showed Grandma smiling beside a llama, 2 children, and a tiny cria with legs far too long for its body. They placed it in a waterproof sleeve beneath the flowers. Eleanor happened to be there too, visiting Arthur. She watched the children walk safely back to their father and felt tears rise. Willow stood outside the cemetery gate with Claire, waiting, not blocking it this time, just waiting. Milo waved at her. Willow hummed. Years later, Sophie would still remember the darkness beneath the cemetery, the cold stone, Milo's hand in hers, Pippin trembling against her knees, the knocking they made with a broken piece of wood against the hatch until their arms hurt. But she also remembered the sound from above, Willow's hum, then voices, then light. She grew up to study architecture and historic preservation, saying that old places deserved care because they held stories, but stories should never be allowed to become traps. Milo grew up loving animals and volunteering at Claire's trekking farm, where Pippin became a tall, mischievous llama with a habit of stealing hats. Willow grew older, calmer, and slower. She remained fiercely attached to Pippin even after he was grown. On rainy days, she disliked being separated from him and would stand at the paddock gate humming until Claire gave up and let them shelter together. No one blamed her. One autumn evening, nearly 10 years after the rescue, Sophie returned to Whitestone Hollow from university. She walked up to the cemetery at dusk with Eleanor, now slower but still sharp-eyed, and Reverend Samuel, whose hair had gone almost white. The cemetery was peaceful, the vault sealed, the grass trimmed, the old yew trees dark against the sky. From below the hill came the sound of a llama humming. Sophie smiled. Willow? Samuel looked toward the lane. Claire was walking past with Willow and Pippin, leading them back from a village harvest event. Willow paused at the cemetery gate. For a moment, the old llama stood exactly where she had stood that morning years before, not lost, not frantic, just still, remembering perhaps, or perhaps waiting for Pippin to stop chewing the hedge. Sophie walked to the gate and rested a hand on the iron bars. "Thank you," she whispered. Willow looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then she turned and continued down the lane. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue. Animals never give proper speeches. Samuel smiled. Maybe that is why we remember them. So before we go, remember this. Sometimes the one standing at the gate is not lost. Sometimes an animal waits in the place where humans must pass because somewhere beyond sight, someone is trapped, knocking in the dark. Willow the llama stood by the cemetery until visitors heard the sound beneath the old ground. She had no words, no map, no way to open the hatch. But she knew her baby was below. She knew children were with him, and she knew she could not leave. Because one llama refused to walk away from the cemetery gate, 2 children were found, a tiny Creo was saved, and a whole village finally learned that even the quietest places must be listened to before silence becomes danger.